the miracle of choice for me when discussing miracles is the virgin birth of God. If you look at the text in Matthew, Joseph is convinced Mary is telling the truth in a dream. It says in a dream. It doesn't say a vision. It says in a dream the Lord spoke to him. And dreams apparently mattered to Matthew. They don't matter to us. Because anything can happen in any dream, and anybody can speak in a dream. But that's the only evidence that Matthew tells us that Joseph had to believe Mary's story that her baby was God, God in the flesh. And Matthew seems to think that that is enough evidence to put the story in his gospel. And I look at the evidence. I look at the attempts to try to show that this baby was God in the flesh, that this baby was omniscient and omnipotent and all present. I don't even know, I never understand how that goes anywhere with that. And I look at the fact that Mark says nothing about it. I mean, you'd think it'd be an important thing to say, and how his family didn't understand where he was from. I mean, it wasn't really important in Paul, and they look at the Bethlehem star. There's no star that we know of that can move in the sky over a birthplace. No comet, and yet that's the language that it talks of. And I go through the various things that apologists haven't considered. They truly have not considered that miracle. They've considered the resurrection. I mean, Gary Habermas is coming out with a 5,000-page, multi-volume work on it, and he says it's going to be new information. Yeah, I mean, like they've scoured those texts, the resurrection texts, all over, but they ignore the virgin birth, the nativity stories, I'll say, in Luke and Matthew, which conflict. And the reason why I focus on the virgin birth is because it's plain as day that there's no reason that you should believe that Mary had a virgin. Maybe Mary was a virgin when she had God in the flesh born to her. And this is a test case because we have no objective evidence for it. Now, I know the standard replies. I've been in a debate on it recently. You can look that up online. But there's no objective evidence to believe it, and I don't think there's any objective evidence for any of the other miracles. And I argue that. Well, all we have is testimony. We have, for the resurrection, for instance, we have the Gospel of Mark and Paul. That's it. We don't have the testimonies of anybody else. We only have Mark and Paul. Any testimony that Mark or Paul says is conveyed to us by Mark and Paul. So we only have two witnesses, really. We can't cross-examine the others in Mark and the ones who plagiarized after him, Luke and Matthew, and there is no Q. So objective evidence, that's what I'm commenting on, and we don't have it. We just simply is not there. Now, what would that look like? It would look like DNA evidence. It would look like cell phone evidence. Now you say, well, I'm sorry, cell phones weren't invented back then. Well, then why didn't God have the resurrection take place in the year 2020? Well, because he didn't. Well, why didn't he? 2020 would have absolved everyone in the past of their sins, just like 3033 AD absolved everyone in the past. What would the difference if he waited till 2020 where it could be documented? So objective evidence, there is none. There simply is none. You have textual evidence. Well, that's objective evidence. Text is objective evidence, but it's only objective evidence from the author himself. So objective evidence is the key, and I found there was none to believe the specific sectarian Christian faith.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't seem that if there's a God, that he's in the business of concrete evidence, at least not on every point in the story of Christ or prior to that. But I would contend that there's a possibility, not to have it every possible way, but there's certainly a possibility that the interpretive lens through which these stories are viewed was very different from our kind of journalistic standard today, that it would allow for story to take on a different significance, even if it was never expected to be, or could only be presumed as true, in some symbolically meaningful way. Which, of course, if you are searching for objectivity, that's not it. It's a different way of viewing the world culturally, when you really don't have the means through which to investigate every detail. So I don't think it could be excluded from the character of a god to allow a lack of concrete evidence. Do you?
Well, in the storytelling age of the first century, where myths were shared at the campfires and told to kids, I don't see why God couldn't have used something like that. I don't deny that. I'm not rejecting that. I am rejecting the idea that there's a God who knew everything that we know today in modern society, where we regard objective evidence as important for every discipline of learning in the university, except tennis and I don't know, other things. So, and then yet there might be some objective evidence to show that some ways of playing tennis is better than others. But so this God had no foresight. The storytelling God, the God of the emotions, had no foresight to realize that in our day and age, objective evidence is key, and to not have given that somewhere along the line would be inefficient of him.
So, of note, your friend you alluded to, James Strauss, he uses the quote, "All truth is God's truth," which I believe you translated that as suggesting that whether it is secular or otherwise, it's in the domain of reality. It could belong to God, correct? And I see that as maybe serving both arguments in a way. That if it is of nature, and the definition of God is the supernatural overseer, that within that domain, you wouldn't have to reconcile what is real against what is God.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. God's truth, all truth is God's truth, is actually taken from Arthur Holmes's book and lectures.
I think that's originally a very old quote.
Augustine.
Augustine.
Yeah. Right. Okay. But he would stress that, and the idea was that if it's true, it's of God. If it's not true, it's not of God. And it doesn't matter where you find truth. You could find it in any discipline of learning, or you could find it in the Bible. But it's not to be rejected simply because it's, say, not found in the Bible or not found in the past. So that's, I take it, what he meant. And so I did pursue truth. I did. It didn't matter whether or not it was in the Bible or not. By reading science books, philosophy books, theology books of other denominations, I was looking for truth. Right. And what I found was that I had to reconcile that truth, the truth I found elsewhere, with what I learned of the Bible, and that truth overwhelmed. That truth was buttressed by objective evidence, and that's what caused me to initially start reinventing the Bible, reinterpreting the Bible. And so gone was, the 6-day creation. Gone was every possible reconciliation of Genesis, and I think one of the Psalms, and Job, ending of Job, recognizing those creation stories with what we know from science. And I mean, just nothing but myth, pure myth, and non-historical myth, myth that has no basis for it. And before you know it, other stories started to fall by the wayside as well, like the flood, the Tower of Babel, and even Abraham. How do we know he existed? I mean, you really scant evidence just in the Bible, I think, itself. So all of a sudden you start questioning everything in the Bible. I mean, why not? I mean, if they include this, why not start questioning it? So, snakes that talked, and accents that floated, and fire called down from the sky, and all these things, including a virgin birth. And once you enter the New Testament, you do so through the virgin birth. And then what other miracles? I mean, all we have are Gospels, which present Jesus as having the last word in every debate with the Pharisees and scribes, and Herod and Pilate. And so we never find that in reality. We never find someone who gives a one-liner to end a debate. Never. So this is something going on in here. They're presenting Jesus as someone he's not. I mean, you can't possibly say that the Pharisees didn't have answers for everything Jesus said. And I studied that out. I found that the Pharisees had adequate responses to everything Jesus said. Pharisees and scribes. I mean, they're not stupid people. I mean, unless you say they are. So there's certain things then that you have to start questioning. And the Damascus Road experience of Paul. Well, what did he see? Well, we don't know. I mean, if we want to take it all at face value, what did he hear? Well, some voice. But he's prone to hear voices, just like the author of the book of Revelation. It says, Jesus spoke to me and wants me to write down 7 letters to the churches in chapters 2 through 3. What evidence do we have that this guy isn't just creating things like we find in much of the apocryphal literature of that day, of voices and angels and deities speaking to people who wrote down letters? Well, we have none. So you have to just say to yourself, this is a way that preachers use even today. They would say, well, I have a voice from God, and I want to tell you what I heard, and we shouldn't believe any of that. We shouldn't accept that. And then you just extrapolate that to the whole Bible itself, and before you know it, thus saith the Lord means nothing. So it's a process. It starts with demanding objective evidence. Sometimes it requires a crisis of faith. And not everybody's going to feel that way. Not everybody's going to think that way. But that's my journey, and and I'm sticking to it.
All right. Well, I would actually agree that we shouldn't accept anyone's statement purely at its own word. I think the New Testament would advocate for an experiential basis for testing the beliefs, and whether or not you can see a manifestation of that. It may just come from a point of grasping at something to deal with the mystery for a lot of people, hoping that there is a spiritual source in their moral impulses, you could say. And I wonder for you, when you kind of sought out truth from a post-faith perspective, was there a challenge in moral decision making?
Well, let me just. Here was the dilemma. Okay, evolution is true. We don't need a God to explain it. God is superfluous. He's unnecessary. Now, I'm not going to overturn evolution. They have overwhelming evidence for evolution. I'm not going to overturn that by saying something like this. Well, what about morality? How am I going to live life? What I'm going to do is I'm going to accept the brute fact and say, okay, it looks like I'm on my own, and accept that and just try to deal with it and live with it. And that's what we do. And it starts with our families. It starts with the people close to us. We want the people close to us to live good, happy lives. You explain, justify that. That's asking a ridiculous question. Justify your love for your wife. Justify your love for your kids. Come on, you can't justify it, can you? I swear that's a bizarre question to ask. I naturally do so. And so then I want a good society for my children, and that means trying to make sure that the society is good for them. And and so we enact laws for the evildoers, those who don't care about society, the narcissists, the sociopaths, the psychopaths, and we have to have the police force to help us do that. And the best way to handle that society is through a democracy where we all get a voice, all get a thought, all get an opinion. And we don't like the democracy sometimes when it produces people like Trump. At least some of us don't, but it does sometimes. And that's still the best we've got, and I would much certainly rather look at the evidence of what produces a good society and a good response to coronavirus than merely people who say, well, God's Trump is Cyrus and he's God's ordained person. Well, what evidence do you have? Then when we're talking about the evidence, we're talking about what makes for a good society. So I found no consternation with saying, all right, I'm on my own, and I didn't like it. Sometimes, I would cry. I would cry as I was going through the transition because I wanted somebody to talk to, and there was nobody to talk to. Found myself talking to myself, then I laughed at myself, in my opinion. But I found you just have to accept the fact. Bite the bullet is the phrase. You just bite the bullet and you move on. You cannot overthrow the overwhelming evidence for unguided evolution by saying, well, I'm going to reject that in favor of God's morality. When you look at the Bible and you find that the morality that we find in the Bible is bizarre. And I wrote an anthology on it called Christianity is Not Great. I think it's my biggest book, where we documented what faith can do to people and the harms and the almost total destruction of indigenous peoples in the name of the cross, and on witch trials, crusades, faith healings, and what it does and does it do, and how it causes pain, and all kinds of things. So I would much prefer that even Christians adopt the Catholic stance that says that you can figure out morality by just looking at the world, than try to find it through the Bible.
Is the system of sort of social determination and enforcement of rules as they create them, is that what you mean when you say neo-humanistic purposes in God or Godless? And you said only neo-humanistic purposes can help us?
Yeah, I think I put the neo in there because I don't know what other word to use to include animals. And
Okay.
I have a chapter in there on animal suffering and why God did nothing for animal suffering and why he created animals. I mean, we don't need animals if there's a God. He could have created us such that photosynthesis would feed us. And I go into that in detail in my book, Why I Became an Atheist. There's 2 chapters on the problem of suffering. I mean, we have to ask ourselves what this world would look like if there is an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, and rather than look at the world and try to fit that peg into the square hole of a God, of the animals and their suffering. I mean, we just simply don't need predation in the natural world unless evolution is the case. I mean, it's clear as day because 99% of the species have died out, and if you look at the natural world, there are things being killed or eaten, millions and millions of times every hour around the world. So that betrays the whole notion that what you're looking at is you're looking at the world, and then you're creating a God out of that world. Okay, here's the world that exists. Now, what kind of God should exist? Rather than conceptually considering what an omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent God would create. And you've got it bass backwards. Consider what the God that you actually believe in, what his attributes are, and then look at what kind of world he would create. And this is not that world.
Yeah. I understand that point. Well, and I believe that looking at the Bible, even it's clear that our understanding of morality evolves, and with that, the way that we talk about God. And just to be clear, I want to confirm you don't feel that morality comes from an absolute source, even on a human wiring sort of level, right?
Well, I think there's a morality per species. I think there's a certain morality that can be detected with chimps and with dolphins and other species. Some are more noticeable than others. Dogs, pigs. I think there's a certain type of morality to be expected as every species treats each other better than it treats, the outsider.
Sure.
So I think that we've domineered over the animal world, and I think that we should back off. But I think there's a morality for human beings, and we don't always discover in certain countries. It's usurped by dictators, but I think democracy is the best way to figure it out, if it can be figured out at all. And That's how to live. Look, if you want to live in a society where people are treated equally, the best way to do that would be to have a democracy. And I think democracy has proven its worth and will continue to do so, even though there are certain democracies that don't work. It's just still the best way to go if you want a good society. So yeah, I think now that's the human species morality.
Yeah, well, there does seem to be a correspondence between what we call good, what we call pain and pleasure, and survival of a given species. And I guess the traits of that evolve even more so in human beings as we elevate the propagation of values even higher or proportionately higher than genetic propagation. So that makes us unique in a sense. But I guess we're still animals, and I don't even know if I would contend that humans have somehow a distinction that puts them in a different category of morality or not. There's some things that I don't even claim to have an answer for, but I do find it interesting that you suggest.
Yeah, we're not distinctly different species, because we all share some of the same DNA. So, but as a species, more often than not, we do have the same needs and desires. Maslow's hierarchy of needs applies distinctly to the human species, and if we if we try to get along, I mean, I don't want anybody to rape my daughter, so I'm going to have a law against raping daughters or women, and it should apply to everybody because we can't give anybody an exception. And so, it's easy. I think it's easy to find a lot of laws, and I think that you don't find them in the Bible. Rape, by the way, is not found in the Bible. You'd think that a good God would have included that somewhere, or thou shalt not enslave others, but that's not found there either. But we can figure that out for ourselves without God. In fact, in distinction from what He decided was important. So we can find that out, and we can enable the society to enact that into law and enforce it by the police, even if people disagree. I'm sorry, I disagree. I want to rape somebody or kill somebody. Well, you can disagree all you want, but you're going to jail for a long time. And jail, by the way, is a happy happy way to punish somebody rather than lopping off their heads or burning them at the stake or all kinds of other tortures. So we keep improving, like you say. I mean, you agree. Morality evolves. I mean, what can best account for that? I mean, I think that what happens is that the Bible has encapsulated an ancient barbaric morality because it's a written religion, and we've been fighting the written claim to revelation from a divine God ever since. I mean, there are kings. Democracy was fought. Well, we can't have that. We can't have women vote either because of what it says about women. So women had to fight for that. We have to fight to become a more civilized society because of the influence of the Bible in our society. But we can do it, and we are doing it without the help of the Bible. I mean, we have to reinterpret it. Just like when we come back to the issue of homosexuality, it's a tough argument to make that, and you know this, you're more current with it than I am. It's a hard argument to make that God loves homosexuals. It's just hard. I know I made it. Trust me, I know. But it still is hard.
You mean from the Bible, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be made, and I ended up making it before I decided to leave the faith. I mean, I said, oh yeah, I say it depends on Adam and Eve, and it wasn't Adam and Steve. But then what happens is, once that story, the Adam and Eve story, is shown to be nothing but myth, then you have no reason to say that accept the evidence. Homosexuals are born gay, and I don't have to worry about what the Bible says now. I just have to listen to science.
Right. Well, for you, having had many of these arguments, I'm sure you've seen that in a lot of cases, I don't think Christians even naturally want to defend some elements of the Bible. What elements those are different from person to person. But sometimes they feel like they have to come alongside it and give it the interpretation that their doctrine supports. And maybe that's where the outsider test comes in a bit, is that once you can step back to realizing that this has a lot to do with defending things that have just always been a necessary part of the program, you could take a fresh look and either see how it can be aligned with your honest perception of reality, or how it really just doesn't fit.